Well, hi there, and welcome back to Pastors on Porn. I've just been thinking how much it seems like as pastors and leaders, our life is a continual process of recalibrating our lives. And I was kind of humming along I felt I had some good margin in my life, that book Margin, and I felt like, I got a little bit of margin, I'm good. And I feel good. Partly it was probably because it was summertime and I wasn't doing a lot of substitute teaching, but the fall has hit and I'm going, man, I feel like I went from living at 95% to 102%. And that extra 2% is keeping me 2 inches under the water. So all of a sudden I've been coaching, of course. I do coaching for pastors. And then I stepped in and have been helping Matt Dobschuetz coaching some of his Rev groups, which has been a lot of fun. And on top of that, coming into the fall, I've started speaking once or twice Sunday mornings again, and also substitute teaching a day or two at the local high schools. And and all of a sudden, I'm developing this backlog of podcasts that I want to do, and I'm just going, oh my goodness, I got to recalibrate all over again. So I think all of you can probably identify with that feeling. So I'm not sure if I'm going to cut back to maybe just teaching one day a week. Anyways, that's a little bit of why I have been so remiss on doing podcasts, either this one or my general one, finding traction. But today, as I talked about in the last couple episodes are around our pastors creating a porn culture. And then the very last episode was our pastors creating a shame culture in the church. And one of the things I had previewed was the idea, I want to talk about this whole area of the discipline of church leaders. Just for this reason, I've seen, certainly now in working with Christian pastors and ministry leaders, I work with those who are struggling with addictive sexual behaviors or unmanageable sexual behaviors. And I've seen a whole range of responses that happen when pastors' sins and struggles become public knowledge. I've seen examples of where pastors are unceremoniously sacked and shown to the door. The picture of that security guard kind of escorting the employee with only their cardboard box of mementos. I've seen that. I've seen other situations where pastors have gone into an extended period of time away from the church. Some to return, but others to move on because the elders felt it was best for everybody concerned. Sometimes the people in the church are not even told what happened to the pastor, just some vague, well, they stepped down for personal reasons. I love that, personal reasons. That just covers about everything. Some people, pastors are quickly returned to ministry without barely a hiccup. There's a quick confession, a mea culpa kind of thing. All is forgiven. And then there's some who continue in their ministry in some ways, albeit in maybe more of a circumscribed or accountable way. So that's a lot of different variations I've seen. And I still can be surprised as I listen to pastors and understand different church cultures. But it's been interesting as I hear about pastors and their stories as they're exposed or as their sins become public. Now, I did an earlier podcast, actually episode 4, where I discussed this question: should I resign? And that is more of a personal question that pastors need to think about in their call and their ministry in the midst of unmanageable sexual behaviors. And I'm not going to go over that material. You can go back and check it out. Today, what I want to focus on is how those in authority around the pastor, how they deal with the revelation that their pastor has been living a secret sexual life. I want to start by, again, from my experience, what I have seen in my takeaways. This is, you may or may not agree with me, but these are some things that I've seen that I think are unhelpful approaches to the struggling pastor. and ones that I think proved to be counterproductive over time. So these are some postures or approaches that I think that elders and those around the struggling pastor should avoid. The first one is this. It's some kind of soft-pedaled approach, including perhaps a bent loyalty to the key leader. Now, we all have heard the stories of the scandals at Willow Creek, Ravi Zacharias Ministries, things like that, where board members and those who surrounded the leader, they unquestioningly believed and supported the story or narrative of their uber leader, and they refused to accept the possibility of their beloved leader's indiscretions. Instead, what they did, they responded to the possibility of those truths by simply circling the wagons, minimizing the behavior of the key leader, and then even questioning or attacking those who were asking the questions or making the accusations around that leader. Now, in those situations, of course, when those who surrounded this key leader or who defended this leader, when they had to then face escalating ripples as more and more details emerged of their leader's sins, they were caught flat-footed. And eventually they were even seen as being complicit to some degree in their leader's bad behavior. You could add to that factors where it seems like you have an organization that is essentially an extension of the leader, and it almost creates a too big to fail leader. We've heard during the financial crisis of, dozen plus years ago, where organizations seem to be too big to fail. Well, these are organizations where the leader is almost too big to fail, where the leader's reputation is part and parcel connected with the reputation of the entire organization. So sometimes there's justification and soft pedaling because, we just need to, almost like we counterbalance the bad reports we hear with all of the good things that leader has done. Sometimes there's almost a situation we say, well, sometimes you have to put up with the bad because that's just kind of an extension of all the good things or some of the aspects of this leader's personality or character. Sure, they might go too far in some areas, but you know what? They say it like it is, or that's what happens when you have a leader who takes the leader, an organization into uncharted places. Sometimes elders actually make that kind of determination. They go, you know what? Compared to the bad that's been done, there's been a whole lot more good. So, I don't think that's helpful at all, that soft pedaling, bent loyalty approach. The second one I don't think is helpful is a secret approach. Now, I get it that there's a lot of appeal in keeping things on the down low and under the carpet. The reasoning goes something like this. Think about how this information will hurt the family of the pastor. Maybe that pastor's spouse and their children. Do we want to subject them to public ridicule or hurt in this way? Or perhaps the thinking is, well, think about how this public knowledge will disillusion and maybe hurt a number of people who come to this church who look up to this leader. This sort of knowledge will only hurt them, or worse, discredit the church and our public witness. Wouldn't it just be more loving to keep things under wraps? I know all about this. My natural response as a pastor, first of all, is to hide those things that I am ashamed of. But sometimes that hiding impulse extends to the leaders around the one who has been caught or exposed, and they're now learning of that information. If we do call ourselves, and I think most of us would claim to be Bible practicing Christians, we do have to struggle with the clear instruction that Paul lays down in 1 Timothy. In 1 Timothy 5:20, Paul says this, "But those elders who are sinning, you are to reprove before everyone." so that others may take warning. Well, how do we deal with that in today's world, which values privacy and discretion? Well, first of all, I'm not a Bible scholar to go into all of the nuances of it, but I want to say a few things that come to my mind from that passage. I think at the very least we can say that this biblical command means that we need to hold others and each other accountable, especially to those who lead in our church. Leaders, pastors, elders, we do have a special influence, and as a result, we need to be held to a higher degree of accountability. Now, let me just say, it's not just sexual sins. Let me say that again. It's not just sexual sins. Perhaps your pastor is somebody who traffics in conspiracy theories on his Facebook page, or posts dubious medical claims, or is always pushing certain political buttons. Or maybe he displays contempt for other pastors or churches. All of those are things that don't reflect on the character of God. Sexual sins are not worse than other sins. That isn't biblical. We all need to be accountable for how we all, especially leaders, display the fruits of the Spirit. So, another thing that I would say around that injunction of Paul that these things are done publicly and not in secret is some translations have said those who persist in sinning. I guess you could make a biblical argument that this especially applies to those who've shown a pattern, a sustaining and deliberate pattern of acting out of accordance with their clear biblical mandate as a spiritual leader. So that's another factor you might want to put in. All of that said, here is the uncomfortable truth. Scriptures do record the sins of leaders for all to see. It does provide vicarious learning. This Sunday, I'm speaking on Psalm 51. It starts out, for the choir director. We're going to all now sing about David's sin with Bathsheba. And it's like we're putting it into song. It's like, how would you like your sins to be put into song? Okay, we're going to write a song about Vern's sins, and we're going to do it as a 3-part harmony throughout the church. That's what Psalm 51 is all about. Why would God expose David to that public thing? So we all can learn and grow, and David himself participated in it because he wrote it. When it comes to vicarious learning, I used to tell my teenage kids, I used to say to them, kids, I didn't call them kids at that time. I said to my kids in high school, there's 2 ways that you can learn, And they would go, yes, Dad. I'd say you can, first of all, learn from your own stupid actions, or you can learn from the stupid actions of your friends. And they would look at me and I would say, now, which one do you think would be more painful? They're both instructive, but one is more painful than the other. And they would go, yes, Dad, we get it. I would tell them as they're heading out to a party or something, right? So I think that verse is saying there is a role for vicarious learning. And sometimes us leaders are the object lesson. Now, I think it does also, it's a good thing to say, it does also depend on the nature and scope of how those pastors' actions have affected those around them. There may be some situations where private accountability, confession, and amend making is more appropriate. There may be other situations that have affected everyone that it's important for everyone to know. The bottom line, though, is that leaders are more publicly accountable than the average person. We should not shy away from telling the truth about leader sins. It's something we can't ignore biblically. There's an old recovery saying, I think I learned it in AA, that says this: we are as sick as our secrets. It applies to individual people. It also applies to churches. Churches are as sick as their secrets. It's kind of like that phrase, well, we know where all the bodies are buried. If a church has a whole bunch of buried bodies or a whole bunch of secrets that we don't talk about, then that church is dysfunctional. It's one of the reasons where I often told on myself before anybody else could tell on me. I always figured if I'm the first one telling the truth about me, I'm out in front of it. Here's the last point I want to make. Again, 1 Timothy 5:20 says this: but those elders who are sinning, you are to reprove before everyone, so that others may take warning. Now notice it said you are to do what to them? You are to reprove them. Most people say you are to remove them. That's not what the passage says. There's a distinction, by the way, between reproof and removal. I think that's a distinction worth mentioning that many people have forgotten. That leads to my next point. I think it's unhelpful when those who surround a struggling leader or a sinning leader, their very first impulse is to take a punitive approach. It's interesting that one of the things I hear by people who hear about a fallen pastor or a struggling pastor is they're so afraid that the pastor is going to get away with it. Where are their consequences, people ask. You go, well, what are people really wanting oftentimes? Well, the answer is to punish the offender. They've disappointed us, they've hurt us, or they've hurt our church, or they've hurt people we love, and they must be held accountable. When we say that, what we mean is they must be punished. And I've even seen people trying to exact punishment in the name of or on behalf of a betrayed spouse, even when the spouse is calling for a more compassionate or redemptive approach. And I'll just say this, as I'm working with pastors in this scenario, I would say the very last thing any of these guys have ever said, and most of the guys I'm working with, they would say they've gotten away with something. Most of the men I've been with, I'm going for a walk with a guy shortly, the same way they would say, I never realized how much this would cost me. I would do anything to have a do-over from what I've experienced and gone through. Yet there is something deep and dark in us that wants to punish people for the ways they've disappointed us. I just heard recently of a law in Texas. I'm not sure if it's passed or they're trying to pass it, where they're trying to deny prisoners on death row the opportunity to have a pastor with them for their last moments of life. They don't deserve it. Punish them. Again, there's something deep and dark in us that want to punish others for the sins that we don't struggle with or can't identify with. I understand that we want to see repentance from pastors. I get it. You can go back to lesson 38 and we talk about this whole issue between repentance and remorse, and you can listen to that there. So that's the third, that sort of punitive approach. And the last approach that I just have found to not be helpful, I'm just going to label a simplistic approach. Like many of you, I've been listening to some fascinating, interesting, engaging podcasts on, for example, the rise and fall of Mars Hill, reading podcasts like Tove versus Toxic Churches, or when narcissists go to church. I've been reading a lot of those, and I'm reading a lot about toxic or narcissistic or predatory leaders that just in retrospect seems so obvious, but while we're in that, do not seem that obvious in terms of how we need to deal with that. And I know those are written in part not just to voyeuristically look at how some churches have struggled or fallen apart, but to also try to find lessons for us to deal with in our present church systems. I am concerned sometimes, though, with what I see what can be really simplistic takeaways from books like that or podcasts like that, whether that's accurate reflection of the authors or just the takeaways from them. Let me give you a few examples. You could say, well, the problem right now is our celebrity culture. Like, Hillsong, the pastor in New York. That's the problem. Celebrity pastors. Anything that elevates a pastor, we got to cut that out. Well, the bottom line is our knee-jerk reaction could simply try to remove any influence of a visionary pastor unless they get too big of a swelled head. Let's not give them any real authority. Let's bog them down with checks and balances so they don't have too much of a profile. I think that's a simplistic takeaway. Here's another one. There are certain leaders out there who have real character flaws, be it sexual or something like narcissistic tendencies. And here's the solution. We just need to root out those leaders, or even better yet, never give them a platform in the first place. Well, I see that sort of a ham-fisted pendulum reaction where we create a culture where we're suspicious of any leader who struggles. So, if a leader perhaps confesses a struggle with pornography, the risk management team kicks into place and goes, he must be one of those leaders with deep character flaws. We need to root him out to protect the church and, of course, to protect us from any negative press or liability. I always love it when churches have lawyers on call. For me, that's always a bit of a warning sign. And the truth is just never that simple. There's no such thing as good people and bad people when it comes to leaders, at least in my experience. Leaders with good character and leaders with flawed character. Life's not black and white like that. I don't necessarily consider myself a real Calvinist since I don't believe in total depravity all the time. But here's where I land. I am partially depraved in some part of me. And I'm partially glorious and godlike in other parts of me. And that's true of every pastor that I know. So the idea that there are good pastors with no negative flaws and bad pastors with character issues is far too simplistic. I got a guy in one of my pastors groups, and we all have struggled with porn, and we're all together seeking to create a more redemptive lifestyle and walk into freedom more and more in our lives. And it's really interesting. So here's a guy who struggled with porn, struggled with his depraved side, and a colleague of his left his wife for another woman. And he said, you know what? I never thought he was the sort of guy that would happen to. I always thought he was one of the good guys, which is really funny because, despite his own depravity and despite his own dark impulses, yet he still saw other people as good guys and bad guys. So you know what? We're all susceptible to it. So let me just say this. If you're working with a leader who has confessed to failure or a sexual struggle by either action or implication, I don't think it's helpful to go, well, I guess you're not one of the good guys. Since you struggle with sexual sin, we obviously made the wrong decision to hire you in the first place. Which may, of course, raise the question, well, what does that say about your ability to hear God as elders? But we'll leave that one alone for a sec. So, all of those, I think, are unhelpful postures when it comes to working with the sexually struggling pastor. Let me give you 2 or 3 things that come to mind that I think are far more helpful. The first one is this, which is just the opposite of a simplistic approach. It is a nuanced approach. A nuanced approach isn't one where, one size fits all. You have to make distinctions between various situations. Was a pastor looking at porn? Okay. Well, what's the nature of that porn that was being looked at? All of it's sinful, yes, but there is a distinction between legal and illegal porn. Illegal behavior can and should be paired with the legal processes where, if appropriate, legal consequences are brought to bear. A good pastor friend of mine had it brought to his attention by an IT person that somebody in their office was viewing child pornography on one of his colleagues' computers. Well, the police can and should be immediately involved. Same for an adult who is sexually engaged with a minor. That's not a place for nuance. You bring in the authorities. Another example, was there inappropriate relational or sexual dynamics with somebody where there was a power imbalance? That has its own special implications. Was somebody's sexual behavior one that crossed what I call the flesh line? Or has it simply remained at a cyber or virtual level? Did it involve real relationships with people in our church or community? Is it something that the pastor engaged with over a long period of time? Or was this the result of a specific set of circumstances and perhaps a one-off scenario? Again, all of them are sinful and inappropriate, but they don't all have the same level. They shouldn't all be dealt with exactly the same. How real time has the offending pastor been with their partner in terms of disclosure? What are the betrayed husband's or wife's wishes? That's important to know, although it's not the only factor, but it is important to be mixed into appropriate response. Again, you might be thinking, Vern, some of this stuff's getting pretty complicated. Well, it does, and this is where, wisdom is required. This is where being part often of a larger denomination, this is where it really does save your bacon. Again, I don't think that one size fits all. Policies can provide helpful guidelines, and I'm for policies, but I have far too often seen a policy book used a lot like a hammer that treats any struggle like a nail. So, the last thing, and this might be discouraging to any elder or listener who's wrestling with this, let me just say this. No matter what approach you take, people are going to disagree with you, and it will divide people. You can't help that. Some people will think you're being too hard. Some people will think you're being too soft. You perhaps can mitigate the damage, but there will be damage. That is simply the result of sin. So if you're hoping to find the perfect approach that will keep there from being any damage, you're living in a Disney World. So I would say the first thing is a nuanced approach. Second one is this. Actually, a nuanced approach also means a wise approach. Second one is a compassionate, restorative approach. Galatians 6:1 says this, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves." Well, I have to say, I haven't seen a lot of gentle restoration playing itself out in our churches. I haven't seen a lot of leaders who surround the struggling pastor offer to help carry their burdens. All I've often seen is the emphasis on watch yourself. That person is tainted, and we need to remove their poisonous presence before we catch their sexual cooties. They really like the part that says, watch yourselves or you also may be tempted. I would love to think that as leaders, one of our response should be a restorative response. How do we help restore that person back into relationship? Even if they don't find their way back into leadership, how do we bring them back into relationship? Is there a process of amends that we can put into place to help them return to the table? That great line, but for the grace of God, where we honestly and humble look at somebody else going through a tough time and go, but for the grace of God, that could be me. Where has that gone? Or are we more falling into the thing of anyone who thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves? I'm convinced that in the right situation, I could fall, I could sin in almost any possible way. Where does the do unto others as you would have them do unto you, where does that fit in? People ask themselves, if I was discovered in this situation, how would I want to be treated? How would I want my family to be treated? Or do we retreat into this idea of, well, I would never do that. That's just something that I would never even think of. I read an interesting article recently where it was on, that great passage where the woman caught in adultery was brought to Jesus, and how people tended to fall into two camps when they interpreted that passage. Some love the words of Jesus and they really identify with the words of Jesus. He who is without sin should cast the first stone. But others identify with the passage or the words, go and sin no more. And by that they mean go and sin no more. But we wouldn't know that because we've sent you away. Again, I've often said, I probably said more than I know already, but those are just some of my honest reflections as I work with pastors, as I listen to their stories, not just of their sin and how they got there, but as I listen to how people around them are navigating, how church leaders and church systems are dealing with that. I guess I would hope that would at least give us some pause for reflection. I'm always interested in talking to people. My email is bandofbrothers.care @gmail.com. Perhaps you're an elder and you're trying to deal with a situation and you would like to hear things from what that looks and feels like from a pastor's perspective. Perhaps you're a pastor listening to this and go, you know what, boy, I do not want to be a cautionary tale. If there's things in my life right now that I could be the subject of everything that you've just talked about. And I'm not necessarily, I might get a restorative, gentle approach, but more, likely than not, I would become a persona non grata. However that is, I'd invite, you might say, I'm a pastor and I need a safe place to talk to, a safe place to come together with other struggling pastors. And I do that every week with guys. We're on Zoom and we have, Zoom groups for struggling pastors. And you know what? It's just the human condition. So again, I want to invite you to do that. I hope that you find grace in this week. For all of my Canadian friends, happy Canadian Thanksgiving. And we will see you on the other side. And hopefully I can free up some margin to do this more regularly. God bless you.